Welcome to the latest podcast from international law firm Taylor Vinters. Today we're here in Cambridge and I'm joined by Annie Crawford, the CBI Senior Policy Advisor in Washington, DC. Annie today will talk to us about the 2016 US presidential elections, which have proved extraordinary and unpredictable. Ahead of Election Day, we will reflect on the election cycle and share insights into what the results could mean for business with an interest in the US. We will reflect on the primary process and party conventions, the campaigns and policy platforms of the two candidates, opinion polls, and key events to date. We will also discuss other policy and political developments in the United States and how they may impact on your business. So, Annie, a warm welcome. The economic relationship between the UK, post-Brexit, and the United States, you've said that this relationship has always been special, particularly in trade. Why?
So for a long time, and I think we can look back over history, the UK and the US have had an incredibly strong trading relationship, one of the strongest in the world. And despite the turbulence that we're experiencing in both the UK and the US this year, that trading relationship hasn't been called into question. In fact, I think on both sides of the Atlantic, people are thinking about the opportunities as well as the challenges that they may face as a result of the EU referendum and also the outcome of the US presidential elections, whichever way it goes.
You talked about turbulence just now, and you've talked about turbulence before, but post-Brexit, the UK is still the USA's fourth largest trading partner. Do you think, come what may, this trading relationship will endure?
So of course the trade agenda on both sides of the Atlantic is going to shape the strength and the direction of that trading relationship. But that trading relationship goes both ways in both services, in manufacturing, in export imports, in research and development, and it's incredibly broad and deep in both countries. I think whether we're talking about the services industry or manufacturing, we're going to see an extra effort on both sides of the Atlantic to ensure that trading relationship remains strong.
Despite Brexit, despite when we might Brexit or how we might Brexit, the US is going to try and stay a top trading partner with the UK.
I believe so. If you look at the reason that business does business in the UK now, the EU is one factor, but the UK is also incredibly attractive to US investors for many other reasons. If you look at the educational institutions that they have to draw skills from, if you look at the proximity to the EU geographically, those are factors that businesses are going to continue to consider no matter the trading arrangement between the UK and the EU post-Brexit.
Well, that's the history of the trading relationship between the USA and the UK. Let's move on to the ground of how the American election is being conducted. You reminded us in your presentation that it was only a month ago that the two candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, were neck and neck. Hillary Clinton is now said to be 3 or 6 points ahead of Donald Trump. It was only in July they became the candidates. Up until then, we'd had the primaries and a race to see which party and which candidate was chosen. And you've quoted the Peterson Institute.
Yes, the Peterson Institute did a study on the trade policy platforms of both candidates. They're a non-partisan institute, and they found that while Clinton's policy platform would be damaging, that Trump's policy platform would be disastrous, and they argue that it could in fact start a trade war between the US and its trading partners. And that has been the result of the big focus on trade that we've seen in this presidential election, and one that's very important for the business community on both sides of the Atlantic.
So we have had a little light and revelation about what the two parties would do should their candidates win, despite all the trading of insults between one another, and I won't repeat those. It's been a particularly nasty campaign between Trump and Clinton, but we do know something about their policies.
Yes, absolutely. Although the debates have focused a lot on character and fitness to be president, and both candidates have exchanged insults with each other, those policy platforms are something that the business community can analyse and look at what the result would be for their operations should one candidate or the other be elected.
If we run through some of those differences between the candidates now, you talked about the Senate and Congress for getting their policies through. You talked about the difference on taxation. Donald Trump is going to lower corporation tax, I think, to 15%. Foreign policy, education, immigration. We know that Donald Trump has talked about putting up a wall, and the Mexicans. But also you focused a lot on the Supreme Court. Why is that?
So the Supreme Court and the decisions that are made over the next 4 years about who sits on it could be influential for the next 20, 30 years of the US. Appointments to the Supreme Court are lifetime appointments, and there's a current divide of 4-4 between Liberals and Conservatives. And following the death of Antonin Scalia in February this year, there's been a vacant seat, and President Obama nominated Merrick Garland to fill that seat. However, the Senate has not held a vote on that nomination. As a result, some cases are being deadlocked at 4-4. So it's very important, and a big priority for the next president will be getting a new justice on the Supreme Court. We can also expect further seats to come up on the Supreme Court, and that could change the dynamic between the liberal value and the conservative value on the court and decide very important cases.
And women's rights have also been very important in this campaign because of the allegations that have been made against Donald Trump by women. But Clinton would also introduce women's rights and women's equality issues. She would be a champion of both. This has led to some percentage point rise in some states for Clinton.
Yes, and there have been some polls that suggested that if only women voted, that Clinton would win by a landslide, whereas if only men voted, perhaps Trump might win. And there's been an awful lot of interest in that. Of course, should Hillary Clinton win on November the 8th, she would be the first president of the United States that was female, and that would certainly be a turning point in history. She also argues on her campaign, and has done in the past, that she's been a champion of women's rights for her entire career and champions her 30 years of public service, including as First Lady, as a senator and as Secretary of State. And she, of course, makes the case that she's been a champion of women's rights throughout. I think the gender pay gap, for example, would be one area where she'd focus a lot of attention.
And the other thing the IMF raised in its World Forum in Washington in October was the issues for trade were not being put in this election contest, and that we have throughout Europe rising popularism, anti-globalization, which Trump is picking up on. Again, Trump is picking up on protectionism. Do you think that perhaps we know enough about what they would do to encourage trade?
So the trade platforms have been discussed in a lot of depth. Trump has said on many occasions that he has a very negative view of the effect NAFTA has had on the economy, and he would like to renegotiate the deal. He's often criticised Hillary as it was a product of Bill Clinton's presidency. Clinton, on the other hand, as well as Trump, has been critical of TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Obama's not sent to the Hill yet to be voted on by Congress, and it's not clear whether that will happen in the lame duck session. While both candidates have been anti-TPP on the campaign trail, we could see perhaps in a Clinton administration that there would be some tinkering around the edges of the deal to ensure it meets her highest standards, in which case we could see TPP moving forward. And of course, the USTR, the US Trade Representative, is currently focused on TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So I don't believe that the level of negativity that we've seen on the campaign trail for trade will necessarily remain at kind of fever pitch levels. I do think, as we've seen in the past, candidates are a little softer on the trade agenda in the White House than they have been on the campaign trail.
That's giving us a good insight into what might happen after the election. You said you weren't into the business of predicting, but there have been some predictions as to what the results may be. Some people have already cast their votes. We're 12 days away from the American election, and there are 12 swing states. How do you think the Electoral College votes look at the moment?
So current predictions give Clinton around a 5-point lead on average across the polls, and that's nationally. Of course, in the United States, the shape of the Electoral College means that not only the national polls are important, but also the polls in individual states. At the moment, the national polls and the way the battleground states are breaking down would give Clinton about 272 Electoral College votes, and that's 2 more than the 270 she would need to clinch presidency. On the other hand, Trump looks to have about 126 votes in the Electoral College in the bag, and that leaves 140 to play for at the moment. We're seeing some really interesting movement in some states that are not traditionally considered swing states. Of course, there are still important votes to be considered in Florida, Ohio, Iowa, some of the ones that are traditionally very high profile on election night. In Florida, Clinton has a roughly 3-point lead, whereas Trump has a small lead of about 1% in Ohio and about 3.7% in Iowa. So those are some of the key states to watch, but also some of the traditionally more Republican states where Clinton is doing better than many people had expected.
Now, you also talked about there's usually an October bounce for one candidate or other in an American election. Obama responded to crisis and his ratings went up and he was seen to be bipartisan, which was good. We haven't had this October bounce. It does seem to have been a drip, drip, drip of negativity. So it's difficult to know what the polls might do in the last 10 days.
Certainly the unfavourability ratings of both candidates have affected the tone of the election. For example, Clinton has an unfavourability rating of about 52.9%, while Trump is up there at about 60%. And that has had an impact on the tone and the character of the campaign. Going into the final stretch and reflecting over the last month, we have seen the polls widen. Going into the first presidential debate, the polls looked pretty well tied, and the battleground states were also difficult to predict. A month on from that point, we're seeing Clinton with that lead, which has widened slowly over the past month. Although sometimes we talk about this phenomenon of an October surprise, as you mentioned, this election has seen surprises throughout the campaign, and the events and revelations that have dominated the headlines have certainly influenced public perception of both candidates.
If we just finish with 2 or 3 questions from your audience. One of the things people mentioned was, why was Clinton so unpopular? Was it the baggage of having held office, both as a presidential wife and having been a senator too, and Trump being able to come as a relative newcomer? You talked about him as being a TV show apprentice host, but he's been able to grab that feeling of rising popularism. There's a difference between the two candidates in how they're viewed by the electorate. Is that likely to affect their ability to govern in the future, do you think?
I think that plays into a wider discontent that we're seeing in the US but also around the world, where people feel a disconnect with their governments. What's really important, I think, going forward is that either candidate would need to really learn how to work with the other party. We've seen some really successful efforts on bipartisan legislation in the past, and I think with the dynamics that we're seeing in this election, that will be an important thing to look at going forward.
And one of the questions from the audience was rather perceptive. It said the people who wrote the US Constitution realised that mad people may become president. And you seem to concur with that actually whoever became president over the next 4 years, they would have to work with the Senate and the Congress. So might we be optimistic that things will improve from a terribly negative US election campaign?
Well, I think it was right to point out that there are kind of 3 branches of government, and the Supreme Court, being the highest branch of the judiciary, has an important role to play as well. I think the dynamics in the House and the Senate are also really interesting to look at. Current polls would suggest that the House will remain in Republican hands, whereas the Senate could go either way. Should it be a Clinton presidency, to have a Democratic Senate would be a help to her in working through Congress. I think for Trump, if both the House and the Senate were Republican, that would mean that he could move forward a little bit more efficiently on his agenda. Of course, within the parties, there are differences of opinion on a whole range of policy issues. So some of the campaign positions may be moderated or adapted or changed as we go forward.
And just finally, that special relationship you concluded twice, both at the end of your presentation and at the end of the questions, the special relationship between the UK and the USA post-Brexit and post the American elections will continue and will continue to be positive in the main.
I certainly believe so. I think the depth and the breadth of the relationship that the UK and the US share, it is a special relationship. And I think regardless of the turbulence that we've experienced this year, that relationship has weathered storms in the past, and I think will continue to weather storms in the future.
Well, thank you. And we'll end on that optimistic note. Thanks to Annie Crawford, who is the CBI's Senior Policy Advisor in Washington, D.C. And thank you for joining us today for this podcast from international law firm Taylor Vinters. Please like, share and subscribe. Plus, if you have any suggestions for future topics, leave a comment. We will see you soon. And again, Annie, a warm thank you.
Thank you.